Okay, so I've come here from not quite so snowy Toronto, and from the Holland Bloorview Kids Rehabilitation Hospital. Has anyone heard of the hospital at all? Yeah? So we're a children's rehabilitation hospital that sees kids with disabilities, primarily spina bifida. We also have acquired brain injuries, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and we have 3 inpatient units where people come to us for rehabilitation, normally from orthopedic or acquired brain injury issues. So we serve 7,000 children a year, 608 inpatients, and about 58,000 outpatients. So we get quite a few through. And within that, we have our Spina bifida clinic that sees about 320 children a year. We see most of the children annually or more frequently if necessary. And we have a multidisciplinary team, so physical therapy, occupational therapy, nurse, urology, a speech language, social worker, and psychologist. So we have, as well as obviously developmental pediatricians as well. So we see children with a range of severity of spina bifida, as well as a lot of different sort of incomes, a lot of different ethnicities. So we see quite a wide range of children and young people. So I'm going to talk today a bit about what the literature says about sexuality and spina bifida. My interest is as a health psychologist, so I do health promotion, which is a big umbrella kind of category. I do a lot around kind of weight management and wellness, but I also am really interested in sort of social inclusion and sexuality and so on in the spina bifida community. So I'm going to talk about what the literature says, but also about a study that we did, and then really sort of think about, so as healthcare professionals or as clients going to see healthcare professionals, how can we talk about this topic more? The spoiler of the whole talk is no one talks about it. So how can we start talking about this topic in a more open manner to sort of promote better relationships and well-being? So starting in young adulthood, as a psychology nerd, I always go back to Erickson, who talks about adolescence and young adulthood. You know, one of the key things we do when we're at that age is we start becoming more independent. We start moving away from our parents more. We start different relationships with peers. We figure out who we are, what's our identity, and that could be our sexual identity, but who we are, what our beliefs are, what our values are, what do we stand for. And sometimes that can lead to big fights with parents when you decide that you feel completely different to them. But it also obviously includes sort of romantic relationships and that sexual identity development as well. And here's the surprise, that although there is there's sort of this myth that anybody with a disability isn't a sexual person, does not have sex, does not think about sex. And I think everyone in the room could agree that is not true. This is these are some wedding photos of this couple. And they said whenever they were out in public, people would assume that she was his carer or a sister or someone, and would never assume that that was his wife or partner. So they're doing some really great work to kind of try and bust this myth. And they did open a centre for sex and sexuality and love and relationships for support and resources. And the other thing is that I've talked to young people in our hospital, and they have told me when they have been asked to leave school sessions about sex because they've actually said, oh, you don't need this information. So you go to the library while everyone else is having this sex talk. So, you know, we wonder why people are looking for this information. So this is all kind of interesting anecdotal evidence and stuff that maybe we've heard or come across. I can see some nodding and agreement. But then what I want to, again, because I'm a researcher and I like my evidence and my research, I went to the literature to say, okay, well then what's the actual literature saying? So about young people with disabilities generally, so any kind of different disability, usually physical disabilities, the research has been done. It shows that young people with disabilities have the same hopes and desires as all the other young people for relationships and for sex. And really the age of having sex actually doesn't change for kids with disabilities and without disabilities. But the differences are often that young people with disabilities have lower knowledge about it for a number of reasons we've already talked about and will talk about. And they're more likely to have information on trying to avoid sexual abuse than they do actually about developing healthy sexual relationships. So there's a very much an angle of the information they're getting. And so parents and healthcare professionals often don't recognize how important it is to give young people with disabilities this information. I say there's this stigma that that no relationships are going to be happening, and often they feel very underknowledged or not knowledgeable. For clinicians, they feel they don't have time, they feel uncomfortable, and they fear they may have some negative reactions. So understandably, young people report that they actually don't have sufficient information about sex and relationships and what that might mean to them as somebody with a disability. So that's disabilities generally, but what about spina bifida specifically? So there's actually been a reasonable amount of work done looking at sexuality and sexual functioning and sexual issues with young people with disability, with spina bifida, and actually and adults as well. So, as I was saying, the literature shows they've got developmentally appropriate desires and for sex and relationships, but high levels of anxiety about starting a relationship, whether they'll be able to have an intimate relationship. And about 2/3 have actually expressed these kind of concerns about having and maintaining intimate relationships. And we know that one of the really big causes of anxiety is around incontinence. So whether they're going to have incontinence during sex, whether that's going to put somebody off, who should they be telling about that? And it's a huge source of anxiety and worry. Now, what's interesting is all these studies tend to be quantitative, so lots of surveys and things like that. But we don't have too much of this sort of qualitative, in-depth kind of look at about exactly what are people thinking and doing and talking about. So that's what we'll be talking about a bit later. But first, I thought, well, okay, so that's the literature, that's boring. What sort of issues do you think are particularly important if we're thinking about sexuality and sexual health in young people with spina bifida? Okay, I'll show you my list then. So, there are some medical issues, sort of around precocious puberty, but also latex allergy. A large one is around sensation, so not having sensation around the genital area. And in women, that is between 4% and 81% of women don't have sensation. But that's a huge number. Like that's, so basically some people do, some people don't. But that can be something as well. There's can be problems with erections and ejaculations, motor impairments, so not being able to move as you might want. Incontinence that we talked about that's come up repeatedly in the literature. Even having reduced social opportunities. So we know some young people find it hard to kind of go out and have friends and can be socially isolated. So that's not going to help your sex life. So also lack of privacy, so parents as well. Stigma, and there are others. I don't like talking about challenges and problems, but we have to recognize some of the areas that might need addressing if we're going to try and promote more discussion about the topics. We'll come back to some of those. So when we come to sex ed, who did sex ed at school? Anyone? No, just me? Sexual education? Yeah? Okay, that's better. I was getting very worried then. So, I mean, we have it at school. It was embarrassing. And I went to an all-girls school, and it was still embarrassing. And most young people with spina bifida say that, man, they got enough sex ed generally. Often through school, through friends, these days through the internet. You know, we know that young people with spina bifida have questions about their sort of functional abilities. Am I going to be able to actually have sex? Am I able to reproduce? Am I able to have children? And these are kind of some real questions that people have, and yet they're not getting any information about that. So parents could be feeling, you know, sometimes they have this medically fragile child when they're younger, you know, and there is a lot of nurturing as they grow older, and may feel very uncomfortable with the idea of that person becoming a sexual person. You know, they think healthcare professionals should do it. Everyone thinks someone else should be talking about the topic. So the parent wants the healthcare professional to talk about it. The healthcare professional has no time and feels uncomfortable, so thinks the parents should do it, and so no one's talking about it. So men with spina bifida are more likely to have received sexual education than women in the literature, and women without hydrocephalus are more likely to have sexual education than women with hydrocephalus. So what's going on? Like, there's something that this is sort of not a uniform approach to giving young people with spina bifida the education that they have asked for and need and would desire. And certainly things like pleasure, sensation, touch, intimacy, you know, none of that's discussed. It may be just you can or cannot have children, or you have a latex allergy, don't use condoms, or something like that, but it's not a positive, none of it's generally framed in a positive, healthy wellness approach. So this is my lead up to our study that I want to talk about today. And really things about communication. So we all know communication is very important. It's important for all sorts of relationships, friendships, colleagues. You have to be, you know, you have to know how to maintain relationships and communication. And there is evidence that being open about sexuality actually increases intimacy with your partner, and actually does enhance overall sexual satisfaction. Now, I don't know about you, but it's pretty awkward talking about sex with a partner or with anyone, especially if we're thinking about youth, when they're still kind of, if you think back to when you were in your teens, early 20s, you know, it's awkward to talk about. But then with a disability, you know, obviously there are those extra layers that make it even more difficult to talk about. And so it may be more challenging to talk to a partner about how your spina bifida affects how you're feeling, what you actually feel, what you want, what makes you feel good. And that can be a hard discussion to have, especially when there's issues like incontinence that are also at play as well. So that's why we want to do the study I want to talk to you today about. And we want to know what are some of the barriers and what are some of the things, the enablers to actually discussing sex and sexuality between those with spina bifida and their partner. And then what strategies have actually got, what helps it go well, what helps that conversation. And then through that, what our sort of hidden agenda is to find out, as healthcare professionals, what can we be doing to kind of enable these discussions. Am I talking slow enough? Yes? No? Okay, I'll try and slow down more. Yeah. Okay. As I say, I get into my talk. So what do young people with spina bifida think about and discuss in terms of their sexuality with sexual and romantic partners? And we split them into those two kind of groups, understanding that there are many different types of relationships. So we recruited young people through our hospital and through our local Spina Bifida Hydrocephalus Association in Ontario. Young people had to be English speaking. They had to be able to provide their own consent. I had an interesting discussion with our research ethics board about this study. They were asking me all sorts of questions about what we were going to do, but they were very supportive, which I think is a great indication. The interesting thing oh no, I knew I was going to do that. Just the bottom point is that they didn't have to have had a sexual relationship to take part, because we wanted to know about sort of other things that they may have been anxious about or predicting. And there's more to sexuality, obviously, than just having sex with someone else. So we wanted to include different perspectives. Any research nerds in the audience, these are just our methods. I'm happy to talk to you about them afterwards if anyone's interested. But we basically did qualitative interviews, one-on-one interviews with these young people. And we talked about their spina bifida generally and relationships generally, so friendships, how they communicated with sort of friends and colleagues and classmates and so on. And then we talked about their romantic relationships and any sexual activity they had experienced or had thought about. And we actually had a young person living with spina bifida who went over our questions to make sure what we were talking about was sort of appropriate and not too old. I like to think I'm still young, and I'm not, so I need other people to make sure I'm not asking embarrassing questions that only middle-aged people ask. So our participants, you don't need to read the thing. This is basically, we had 11 participants, 8 females, 2 males, and 1 transgender male to female. And we had 2 identified as homosexual, 1 was bisexual, and 8 as heterosexual. So this is actually quite unusual for sexual health research. Normally we did manage to get a little bit of variability, which is great, obviously. And they had a range of different continence levels as well. And different mobility as well. So we got quite a good range of different things that might be affect this. So if anyone is familiar with qualitative research, you look for themes within all the transcripts. So we recorded the conversations and then we transcribed them verbatim, and then we sort of read them again and again to try and pick out what are some of the common themes. So the first one was importance of, we asked them, how important is disclosure to you? And they interpreted that in many different ways. So they either talked about disclosing their disability generally to someone else, and then they also talked about disclosing their disability and what that meant for their sexual health, sexual identity, or whatever as well. And they were quite mixed thoughts. So one of them was like, well, yeah, I mean, that's part of who I am, it's part of my identity, like it has to be part of the relationship. So they didn't think anything of it. And then we had Kevin, who was actually much more strident. He said, he actually said, I have spina bifida, I have Kyrie, Arnold Kyrie, I have hydrocephalus. None of it has ever affected me, ever. So why would I tell anybody? So he was very kind of adamant that he really didn't need to tell anyone. And then some people said, well, I'm in a wheelchair, so they kind of know something's going on, but I don't need to bare my soul and tell people everything straight away. So they had really interesting, different approaches to it. All of them actually talked about quite a lot of high anxiety, though, about disclosing to or talking about their disability or talking about their sort of sexual needs and wants. And there were a couple of things. One about timing. So like, well, when do I tell them? Like, hi, my name's Amy, by the way. Or, when we've been out on 5 dates. Or like, when do you have that discussion? So some people took this approach that, they got very close to them. The trust was absolutely key. They'd been out with them for a long time. but they're like, I don't tell them unless it's absolutely necessary. So some of them said, oh, they might see the scar on my back and then I have to tell them. Or so they talked about that kind of like had to be a very close, trusting relationship. Some of them said, yeah, very upfront, like, well, I could have a problem with incontinence. One of them said, you're halfway through and you're like, oh, surprise, sorry, hadn't told you about that. And then some people said, actually, I was really worried about it and I thought they were going to freak out when I told them, and actually they were completely fine, but I still worry about that. So even if they had a positive experience, it could still lead to some kind of high anxiety. And then the other one is around this idea of fears of rejection. And I think we all have a fear of rejection for sure. But they were sort of talking about, whoops, how do I go back? But they had low confidence about talking about it, that they had actually experienced someone saying, I'm sorry, I don't want to be with you because of this. Some of them talked about they had a good self-image. They're like, I'm good with myself, but other people aren't. And so trying to navigate that. And then, let's say, even when somebody had, as I was saying here, I'd expected people to freak out, even when people had positive experiences, sometimes that was, they were still very anxious about it. So then, what about the impact of disclosure? A lot of them talked about sort of normalizing. I just want to be normal. I'm normal, you have to do a couple of different things, but otherwise I'm good. So really trying to normalize that situation. And people talked about it made them become more confident when someone else did, sort of dealt very well with the situation, was totally fine. They were like, oh, okay, and that helped them with more self-acceptance. And then they also talked about, he's like, oh yeah, I told my boyfriend, he was like, oh, that's cool. And then they got on with it. Gotta love teen boys. Yeah. So yeah, it was very much like, oh, okay, so that's interesting. Tell me more. What's that about? So some of them had some quite positive experiences. Now we're talking about maybe a self-selecting sample as well. But people did tell us about some things that had not gone so well. So now this is a bit, as healthcare professionals or in the healthcare system, is really interesting, is they talked about the lack of preparation that they felt they had in order to have these discussions. So they did talk about being excluded from sex education classes, which obviously confirms that anecdotal, what we hear just from clients. They generally thought, yes, they had, I suppose, general sex education was okay, but none of them had that spina bifida specific. So what does that mean for me and my particular needs and wants? And so, they were wondering, things they said was, I don't know if my incontinence is going to be a barrier. I can't feel down there. Does that mean I can't have sex? I don't know how to talk about it. They talked all about these kind of things. And this one guy was saying, you're never encouraged, especially as a girl, I think, to experiment and to explore yourself. And again, this idea around pleasure and sensation are separate from somebody else as well. And then, this is something about sort of talking about that incontinence. Is it going to affect getting a romantic relationship? And a lot of high anxiety around this. And then what they talked about was about maybe taking a staged approach. So you're not going to say, well, one day when they're 15 or 18 or whatever the magic date is, oh, today we're going to talk about sex. You're talking about introduce it gradually and early. And so the next few slides are going to be a bit about how we can maybe do better in clinics or when we're talking with young people. I'll talk more about that staged approach in a minute. So just to summarize what we found, rejection is obviously a part of everyday life, or that fear of rejection. But young people felt intense anxiety around not only when to have discussions, but what to say about how spina bifida may impact on their sexual or romantic relationships. They were really concerned about what effect that could have. not all participants felt that their spina bifida impacted their relationship. So there was Kevin, who's like, it's never affected me, why should I ever talk about it? And that's fine. Although most participants discussed that they felt their spina bifida did impact at least some aspect of that in them in some way. And so whilst experiencing rejection is obviously a typical part of adolescence, some of our participants had really heightened anxiety around this. Our findings really support previous sort of survey numbers, quantitative evidence that incontinence plays a key role in impacting a young person's concerns around sexuality and relationships in relation to spina bifida. And then some of them talked about when they had developed their sort of disclosure scripts, so they had worked out what they wanted to say and exactly how to say it, they felt much more confident about having these discussions, and especially if they had positive responses from their partner, and that gave them more confidence to talk about it. So this is the key question, right? So what do we do as healthcare professionals or in the community or in clinics? And there's a paper that came out just before ours that had also interviewed young people. They actually got them to take photos and pictures of what things meant to them. It's quite an interesting way of doing it. And they said, so the medical community must help empower young people. You say, well, yeah, but how? That's what we want. What do we actually do and say and ask for this? And someone else has written around that youth often feel very uncomfortable talking about this topic or raising the topic. So really, they talk about how it is the role of the healthcare professional to raise this topic, because young people generally are probably not going to. And yet healthcare professionals tell us they feel unprepared, they feel awkward. So again, we go back to no one talks about it. So what should we do? So the staged approach, I think, is this idea that you get young people to be able, or from childhood, be able just to talk about spina bifida generally. Or choose not to, but make sure that they are happy that they could be open about this topic and understand their own spina bifida. So it was interesting because about 4 of our participants, so 4 out of 11, didn't know what type of spina bifida they had. And so it makes you wonder, then it's harder to explain to other people what the condition you have if you don't fully understand it. So there's something, I think, our role around helping our young people or working collaboratively with our young people so they feel confident and knowledgeable about their own body before that they can sort of have to communicate or want to communicate it to someone else. So a staged approach. So one young woman said, don't just give me all of this advice at the same time. So earlier, you might say, about latex allergies. Oh, by the way, you might need to think about this when thinking about birth control. Okay, moving on, and sort of introduce it gradually. Take those teachable moments when you're talking to young people. And this idea of routinely asking parents to leave the room. Who here is who works with young people with spina bifida? Who asks parents to leave the room at any time? No? Yeah. So. But it depends on the age. Of course. But we have also older ones. Yeah. It's not a subject that's brought up, for sure. If they're, yes. So we have an adolescent medicine consultant that comes to our clinic from about 14, 15, and she always throws the parents out. Some of our participants talked about, or people we've talked to, they say, the doctor says, do you want your parents to leave? And they don't want to say yes, because they're worried, the parents are going to say, why do you want me to leave? What are you going to be talking about? So this idea of kind of maybe as a sort of routine that the parent leaves the room for some time, not necessarily just to talk about sex, But it gives an opportunity for that young person to learn how to advocate for themselves and ask questions rather than mum always coming in, because they have their list of things they want to talk about, of course. So this idea of maybe asking parents to leave the room routinely from an age where they can start to develop the skills of talking and advocating, but also then may provide the opportunity to ask them about sexual activity, or if they have any questions, anything they want to know. So that could be sort of a useful strategy to be able to introduce that topic. So, they talk about sexual education needs to be individualized to that particular person, to start early, and then to continue. And it's about kind of healthy sexual behaviors, again, whether it's with someone else or not. That's sort of not the focus of it, but it's questions and, developing these skills to kind of have these healthy relationships. And then talk about routinely ask patients about online sexual behaviors. So with online dating, there's a lot of stuff going on online now, and we talked to our participants about that, and some of them had done online dating, and some of them didn't want to say they had a disability up front on their profile. Some people did. So a little bit discussion around that might even be helpful as well. And the guidance is generally to be confidential. I think young people are terrified that their mum and dad are going to find out about the questions they're asking or the topics. So they're sort of reassuring them it's confidential, to be collaborative, so work with that young person. Obviously non-judgmental, as we always try to be, but especially in these situations. So what we want to do next is, because that all sounds well and good, but what does that look like? So we have developed some videos that we use professional actors to have conversations. So this one is about weight and how you talk about weight and weight management. But what we want to do is do the same kind of thing for how you talk about sex and sexuality, so that people can practice then and look at it in the safety of a training session, before going out and having these conversations, so they feel comfortable having these sort of discussions. We also need to know a lot more about how different kind of sexual orientation affects needs. We didn't have all heterosexual participants that often research does, but we certainly need more evidence around, does that, if at all, affect the information people want or talk about and so on. So I think there's quite a lot of research still there to go. Things like using standardized patients as well, about, say, that practice element. So that was the info. I'm getting the 10 minutes. So that was the information I wanted to give. But what I'm interested in, if you are interested in, is to find out, what have you done before that has worked really well, and where do you think support is still needed? So that, obviously, so this is me thinking, what research should I do next? What sort of things can we develop to help these conversations go well, so that they're more likely to happen again? So I will close with my bit, but I'm welcome to talk either now or afterwards just about people's experiences, thoughts and suggestions. So thank you.